Hello, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. We are pleased to present you with a lecture by Douglas P. Horn. Doug is the author of a 5-volume book on the John F. Kennedy assassination entitled Inside the Assassination Records Review Board. In fact, Doug served on the staff of the ARRB, which was the official board that Congress brought into existence in the 1990s to secure the release and disclosure of government records relating to the Kennedy assassination. Doug's lecture is entitled Altered History.
My name is Doug Horn, and I worked for the Assassination Records Review Board from August of 1995 through September of 1998. I was hired in 1995 as a senior analyst on the military records team and was promoted halfway through my 3-year tour to become the chief analyst for military records. More than 1 decade after the review board shut down, I published my 5-volume book, Inside the Assassination Records Review Board, in November of 2009. In this book, I present my conclusions about the medical cover-up surrounding the JFK assassination, about the alteration of the Zapruder film, and about the reasons why President Kennedy was killed. I want to thank the Future of Freedom Foundation for allowing me to present the basic conclusions of my book in this presentation. The name of my presentation is Altered History: Exposing Deceit and Deception in the JFK Assassination Medical Evidence. Now, it's my conclusion that President Kennedy's assassination was not the random act of a lone malcontent, devoid of meaning or political consequences. This is what the Warren Commission wants the American people to believe. Rather, it was a domestic coup d'etat carried out by a cabal of individuals representing elements of the national security state in reaction to JFK's foreign and military policy, which was covered up by elements of the federal government. Now, that's a strong statement to make, but there's a lot of evidence in my book and in this presentation backing up those conclusions, which you will soon see. Altered History will address what crucial medical evidence was covered up, how it was done, which elements of the federal government were involved in the cover-up, and the most important question of all, why JFK was assassinated. Let's discuss, first of all, what was the Assassination Records Review Board, this organization for which I worked for 3 years? The JFK Records Act was passed in response to Oliver Stone's film JFK in October of 1992. And the intent of the act, as most of you know, was to locate and declassify JFK assassination records held by the federal government, Congress, and private individuals. The act did not authorize reinvestigation of the assassination. The act was drafted by Robert Blakey, the former staff director of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Its intent was to simply free up a large cache of records so that the American people could draw their own conclusions about the assassination. In short, the Review Board was the enforcement arm of the JFK Records Act. Now, its primary functions were to ensure adequate searches were conducted by all branches of government, to conduct declassification review of all records that federal agencies did not want to release in full. And over the 4-year lifespan of the Review Board, over 60,000 such records were reviewed, 60,000 records which government agencies wanted to suppress. The methodology employed by the Review Board was that it was an experiment with citizen review. The Review Board was headed by 5 VIP board members who worked part-time and met 2 to 3 days every month, and a full-time staff of about 25 to 30 people, consisting largely of analysts with some clerical staff assisting. The Review Board also created new records. And when I say new records, I mean deposition transcripts and unsworn interview reports. We'll be talking more about these later in the presentation. There are now about 6 million pages in the JFK records at the National Archives. This includes all of the staff work of the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee on Assassinations and all of their documents, as well as new records created by the Review Board itself. The records released or created by the Review Board have revealed more of the untold history of the United States in several key areas. The ARRB took the depositions of some of the key CIA employees involved in the Lee Harvey Oswald Mexico City episode. So those deposition transcripts are all on file in the JFK Records Collection. Many House Select Committee on Assassination records that had previously been locked away or sequestered were released as a result of the JFK Records Act. Some examples are the Hardway-Lopez report on the Lee Harvey Oswald visit to Mexico City, which is now fully open and unredacted. A large quantity of HSCA staff records related to JFK's autopsy, which had been sealed for 50 years, were released in 1993 instead of in the year 2029, which was the original intent, yielding a treasure trove of information and casting serious doubt on the HSCA's medical conclusions about JFK's autopsy. In the military records arena, the area in which I personally worked, there are four categories of records which are now available to the public in the JFK Records Collection, which were not available before the work of the Review Board. We now have the full meeting minutes from the May 1963 SecDef Conference on Vietnam. This is Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara chairing one of his periodic conferences on the Vietnam War in Honolulu, Hawaii, with all the key players from the national security establishment present. During this meeting, he is implementing President Kennedy's orders to withdraw from Vietnam by the end of 1965 and to withdraw 1,000 men before the end of 1963. He's giving the orders to the people at the meeting, telling them they have to move faster and accelerate their withdrawal plans. So there could no longer be any doubt that President Kennedy was going to withdraw from Vietnam because of these meeting minutes. I believe it's a 213-page document and was found for us and provided by the Joint Staff Secretariat in the Pentagon. Perhaps the most important group of military records released by the Review Board is the Northwoods file, which comes from the spring of 1962. These Joint Chiefs of Staff records document numerous proposed pretexts for a full-scale U.S. military invasion of Cuba, attempts to create a false casus belli, or excuse for war. Now, I want to make it clear exactly what the Northwoods file is all about. The operations officer for Operation Mongoose, General Edward Lansdale, directed the Joint Staff in the Pentagon in January of 1962. He directed them to come up with pretexts for a full-scale invasion of Cuba by the U.S. military. The Joint Staff, which does the homework for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was more than willing to comply with this request. The Joint Staff came up with several shocking proposed pretexts for a U.S.-Cuban invasion. One was to conduct a terror campaign, a real terror campaign in U.S. cities like Miami and Washington, D.C., in which anti-Castro Cubans in the United States would pose as Castro agents and actually shoot and maim individuals inside the United States, conduct terrorist attacks in the hopes of provoking a U.S. invasion. Another proposal in the Northwoods file was to sink a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and to blame it on Castro's government. Another shocking proposal was to take an F-86 jet, a U.S. fighter plane from the Korean War era, paint it with markings that would be the same markings found on a Cuban MiG aircraft, and have it simulate attacks on a real airliner filled with real passengers, firing blank bullets. This is a particularly disturbing scenario because of how foolish it was. People on airplanes have cameras and they take pictures, and any photographs taken of such a presumed attack would have shown that the aircraft was really not a MiG, that it was an F-86, and the whole scenario would have unraveled. The most shocking proposal in the Northwoods papers is the proposal to take an airliner full of passengers have it take off inside the United States, have it land secretly at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, and offload the passengers. The plan was then to take a drone aircraft, another airliner of the same model and make, piloted by an autopilot, have it take off, have it fly over Cuba. The airplane would play a recording indicating it was being attacked by Cuban aircraft, and the controllers of the airplane were then to blow up the airplane over Cuba and claim that the Cuban Air Force had shot it down. All of these outrageous ideas were proposed by the Joint Staff inside the Pentagon. The Joint Chiefs of Staff heartily endorsed all of these recommendations and forwarded them to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. They were later rejected by President Kennedy. If it wasn't for the JFK Records Act, we wouldn't know anything about the Northwoods File. The Northwoods File is a very important window back into the Cold War and what our government was really doing behind the scenes at the time, which at the time none of our citizens knew. The Califano Papers are also an important group of papers. Following the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was resolved in October and November of 1962, following the crisis, the U.S. government spent almost an entire year trying to reformulate its Cuba policy. And Joseph Califano, who was acting as the executive agent for the Secretary of the Army, attended all of these meetings, was a careful note-taker, and appears to have kept all the important memos that came across his desk during that 1 year of planning sessions. So this group of papers, the Califano Papers, is a very important historical record which discusses the attempts to reformulate a U.S. policy toward Cuba after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the important things revealed by the Califano Papers is that there was a serious schism between the State Department and the Pentagon. The Pentagon still wanted to invade Cuba very much. The Pentagon was still in favor of using pretexts for invasion, even though President Kennedy had already rejected that concept. The State Department was not in favor of a full-scale invasion. The State Department wanted to see regime change, and they were willing to help foment a coup, but they were not really in favor of an invasion. So this is the importance of the Califano Papers. They reveal the making of the sausage, as it were, behind the closed doors of government. A final group of records that's important to understand is the Pentagon's 1963 contingency plans for invading Cuba the following year in 1964. These were plans developed by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Maxwell Taylor, which supported not only an invasion of Cuba by the U.S. military the following year, but envisaged doing so under the old concepts in the Northwoods File. General Taylor was openly advocating using more false pretexts for invasion of Cuba. Now, this was contrary to President Kennedy's rejection of the Northwoods concepts in the spring of 1962. So we have evidence here of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, supposedly Kennedy's favorite general, engaged in activities which were contrary to the president's expressed wishes. These contingency plans reveal the following things, all of which are shocking to me as an historian. They included a surprise air attack on the Cuban Independence Day in July of 1964, a surprise attack similar to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. They included developing pretexts for invasion, false excuses for invasion, before the surprise attack, which would supposedly convince the world that the U.S. was justified in its airstrike and invasion. These contingency plans also included wrapping up the invasion and concluding it before the November 1964 presidential election. Presumably, the people drafting these plans in the Pentagon thought that this would make it more palatable to President Kennedy. We don't know today who was privy to this contingency planning above the level of the chairman, General Maxwell Taylor. We don't know if Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara found out about this contingency planning, and we don't know whether President Kennedy found out about this planning. What we do know is that on October 31st, 1963, all of these contingency plans to invade Cuba in 1964 were withdrawn from consideration, formally withdrawn from consideration. There were at least 4 smoking gun documents about the JFK assassination released by the Review Board. Many mainstream historians have falsely claimed that there were no smoking gun documents released by the ARRB. This is not true. Let me show you 4 examples. The first example is an FBI report dated December 1st, 1966, about the Soviet Union's reaction to JFK's assassination. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had successfully planted bugs inside the KGB residency in New York City. So they had a Russian language, true-life version of the Soviet reaction to the assassination, which went from November of 1963 through September of 1965. The FBI translated all of their transcripts into English and wrote a summary report and distributed the summary report within the FBI higher echelons and also sent a copy to Lyndon B. Johnson. In this report, it is revealed that the KGB decided, after conducting a lengthy investigation, that Lyndon B. Johnson was responsible for JFK's assassination. And they secretly informed the staff of the KGB residency in New York City of this finding. Let me expand on this a little bit. Immediately after the assassination in November of 1963, the KGB did not know what to think. They regretted the assassination. President Kennedy and Khrushchev were beginning to work together to resolve Cold War tensions, and they, for this reason, very much regretted JFK's death. Initially, they did not suspect Lyndon Johnson of any involvement. They informed their staff that they needed to conduct the best possible investigation and determine the true facts of the matter in November of '63. In September of 1965, an official traveled from Moscow to New York City and informed the staff of the KGB residency in New York City of the conclusions of this long investigation. So you'll note that this investigation lasted almost 2 full years. And in September of 1965, the KGB colonel informed the staff of the KGB residency that LBJ was responsible for the assassination. We don't know today what evidence the KGB gathered that caused it to come to these conclusions, but we do know that this was a secret finding that was not used as propaganda by the Soviet Union. This was not some conclusion released in Pravda or Izvestia or used in the Third World to try to discredit the United States. This was a secret finding relayed by the KGB to its staff in New York City. What's also interesting is that J. Edgar Hoover sat on this information for approximately 14 months before writing it up in an official report and then distributing it within the higher levels of the FBI and also to President Johnson himself. That delay is also worthy of further study. Now, presented here is the key page of this December 1966 FBI document. This is the paragraph in which the KGB concludes that Lyndon B. Johnson was responsible for President Kennedy's assassination. We don't know the extent to which this was really true because we don't know what evidence the KGB collected, but we do know that they believed it and that they were not using it as propaganda in the Third World. This was a closely held finding released by the KGB only to its own people behind closed doors. I think the document carries much more import when you can look at it yourself and actually read the words. Another very important document that I consider a smoking gun is a memo written by Secret Service Inspector General Tom Kelly. I call it the 7 Days in May memo. In this memo, Inspector Kelly was opposing legislation making the assassination of the president a federal crime because he clearly distrusted the FBI. In the document, Inspector Kelly made scathing comments clearly pertaining to J. Edgar Hoover, which implied Hoover's personal involvement in covering up the true facts pertaining to JFK's assassination. Now here you can see the key page from what I call the 7 Days in May memo. The language employed by Inspector Kelly is unambiguous and clearly indicates that he believed Director J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI was involved at the very least in covering up the JFK assassination. Perhaps the key phrase in this entire memo is the statement by Inspector Kelly that this proposed legislation could be another 7 days in May. The key word in this phrase is another. This indicates that Inspector Kelly already felt there had been a 7 days in May occur in the United States. In other words, he felt there had already been a coup in this country, and that this proposed legislation might be the means by which there could be another coup in the United States. It's a very strong statement for a federal bureaucrat to make in writing. This man was the Inspector General of the Secret Service. He knew what he was doing. He was putting himself on the record about his discomfort with the way the investigation was proceeding. As most people know today, 7 Days in May was the first book in a new genre, the national security political thriller. It was published in 1962 by journalist Fletcher Nebel. The book was about a hypothesized attempt by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to remove the president from office and take over the government. It was a sensation in 1962 when it came out because many people inside the Beltway in Washington were aware that there was considerable friction between President Kennedy and the Pentagon. That's one of the reasons the book made such a splash. The book was so popular that not only did it become a national bestseller in 1962, a #1 bestseller, but President Kennedy encouraged his Hollywood friend John Frankenheimer to make a movie out of the book. And in 1963, director John Frankenheimer did so. 7 Days in May, the film, was due to be released the week after President Kennedy's assassination. The release was postponed because of the traumatic state the country's emotions were in. The movie was released early in 1964. And perhaps because of the disturbing subject matter, following so close on the Kennedy assassination, it was not a great commercial success at the time. So at the time, Inspector Kelly wrote this memo and alluded to the possibility of another 7 Days in May. He was clearly very familiar with the novel and with the film, which had just come out. And he was forcefully trying to make a point in this memo that he knew everyone would understood, providing he used that metaphor. A third smoking gun document is the 1968 Army Intelligence Report about a Haitian named Clamart Joseph Charles. Now, Clamart Joseph Charles was a Haitian who was interested in overthrowing the dictator Papa Doc. He was arrested and thrown in jail, and in 1968, the U.S. intelligence community was attempting to determine whether they should help get him out of jail. So this report, written by Army Intelligence, was a background briefing on everything that the U.S. government knew about Clamart Joseph Charles. In the report, the author states that Vice President Johnson was a close associate of George de Mohrenschildt in 1963. This is a significant statement. George de Mohrenschildt was a member of the U.S. intelligence community. He had been a spy for Vichy France, spying on the United States for the Axis during World War II. He had been closely monitored by the FBI during World War II. Later, he seems to have become a CIA asset. Following Lee Harvey Oswald's return from the Soviet Union in 1962, his first domestic handler appears to have been George de Mohrenschildt. George de Mohrenschildt served as Oswald's babysitter and also as his surrogate father during the first half year or more that he was back in the United States. So when this document states that George de Mohrenschildt, who was associated with Clamart Joseph Charles, was meeting with Vice President Johnson in 1963 and was a close associate of Vice President Johnson, this is a significant statement. George de Mohrenschildt was found dead in the mid-1970s on the day when he was due to be interviewed by the House Select Committee on Assassinations. He had been killed by a shotgun blast to the mouth. the coroner decided that he had committed suicide. Other people are not so sure. George de Mohrenschildt, before his death, had written a manuscript of a book in which he expressed personal remorse for the way Lee Harvey Oswald was treated by the American media and by the Warren Commission. George de Mohrenschildt wrote 8 letters to President Johnson after President Kennedy's assassination. We don't know if any of the letters were answered, but I suspect they were a serious annoyance to the new president. The fact that George de Mohrenschildt, Oswald's handler, babysitter, and surrogate father in 1962 and early 1963 is identified as a close associate of Lyndon Johnson in 1963 by this Army intelligence document is a significant fact with serious historical implications. The fourth smoking gun document that I'd like to talk about today is the November 26, 1963 after-action report of U.S. Marine Corps Sergeant Roger Boyjan. Now, Roger Boyjan, on the night of President Kennedy's autopsy, was the non-commissioned officer in charge of physical security at the Bethesda morgue, where the autopsy was conducted. He wrote an after-action report on November 26, 1963, the day after President Kennedy's funeral, in which he described the activities the night of the autopsy of himself and his physical security detail, which was from the Marine Barracks in Washington, D.C. In his after-action report, Sergeant Boyjan documents the early arrival of JFK's body at Bethesda Naval Hospital 20 minutes prior to the motorcade from Andrews Air Force Base, which was carrying the Dallas casket. The implications of the Boyjan report will be discussed later in this presentation. This is a copy of the key page in the document. It's a 2-page document. This is the front page, and you can clearly see that in the middle of the page, Sergeant Boyjan writes that the casket arrived at 1835 hours. 1835 hours is 6:35 p.m. civilian time. The only problem is President Kennedy's body was supposed to be in the bronze Dallas casket, which had been offloaded from Air Force One at Andrews Air Force Base. And that casket, inside a light gray Navy ambulance, did not arrive at the front of Bethesda Naval Hospital until 20 minutes later at 6:55 p.m. We'll be discussing this later in the presentation. As I stated at the beginning, my presentation, Altered History, is about deceit and deception in the JFK medical evidence. When I talk about deceit in this presentation, I'm talking about the destruction of records. And when I talk about deception, I'm talking about the introduction of false evidence designed to alter history and fool the American people. So let's talk about the deceit, the destruction of records. Now, much key medical evidence has either been destroyed or has disappeared. And without the missing evidence, yes, it's difficult to overturn the official conclusions. However, think about this. The destruction of such key evidence is prima facie evidence of a U.S. government cover-up in the medical evidence arena. If nothing was amiss, why destroy anything? Let's take a look at some key examples of missing or destroyed evidence. There are as many as 18 different views taken of the president's body at his autopsy that are missing from the official record. While I was researching my book, I conducted a study of all testimony on the record of which photographs were taken at President Kennedy's autopsy. This included Warren Commission testimony of their witnesses. This included the testimony of House Select Committee on Assassination witnesses. This also included the 10 depositions the review board took of autopsy participants and the unsworn interviews conducted by the review board staff of other medical witnesses. A careful review of all these records revealed that there were at least 18 views taken at the autopsy that are missing from the official collection today. Let me explain what I mean when I say one autopsy view. One view taken at the autopsy usually consisted of at least 2 black and white negatives and at least 2 color positive transparencies. This was large format film, 4 by 5 inches in size. So one view would consist of at least 4 photographic images. Some views in the collection today consist of, for example, 2 black and white negatives and as many as 7 or 8 color transparencies. So 18 missing views is equivalent to many, many, many missing photographs. Some of the missing views include a photograph of the president's body taken from above with a photographer standing on a ladder looking down at his nude body on the examining table. A wide shot, if you will. Other missing views include the president propped up in a sitting position, propped up by the hands of the pathologist, showing a gaping wound in the back of his head. There are no such photographs in the collection today. Other missing views include extreme close-ups of a small entry wound in the back of his head with the scalp reflected, and of that same entry wound from the inside of his cranium after the removal of the brain. Both views are missing from the collection. The external view of the entry wound from behind and the internal view of the entry wound from behind. They're both missing. Other views that are missing are pictures of probes in the body, metal probes, which would have revealed bullet trajectories in the body, points of entrance, points of exit. Those photographs were developed by a Navy chief, Chief Robert Knudsen, a very reliable witness for the HSCA. Those photographs are not in the collection today. Another important view that's missing from the official autopsy collection is a photograph of the interior of President Kennedy's chest after the removal of the right lung. This photograph was taken to record the position and the appearance of a large bruise on top of the pleural dome, which would have been located above the tip of the right lung. The pathologist and the photographer at the autopsy went to great pains to properly illuminate the interior of the chest cavity in order to take these photographs. They are not in the official collection today. Other missing evidence includes at least 2 skull x-rays. The radiologist at JFK's autopsy was Dr. Ebersol. The Navy x-ray technician who actually took the x-rays was Gerald Custer. Dr. Ebersol has stated in a researcher interview that there were 6 skull x-rays taken that night. Gerald Custer, the lead x-ray technician that night, stated repeatedly over several decades that there were at least 5 and possibly 6 skull x-rays. So as a minimum, we know that there were at least 5 JFK skull x-rays. There are only 3 skull x-rays in the record today. So we know that at least 2 are missing. President Kennedy's brain is also missing. It's important to explain what I mean by this. In 1965, in April of 1965, the president's brother, Senator Robert F. Kennedy of New York, wrote a memo to the president's physician, Vice Admiral George Berkeley. Now, George Berkeley, as a rear admiral, had been the military physician to President Kennedy. He was retained by President Johnson and promoted to vice admiral. So in 1965, when RFK wrote the memo, it was to Vice Admiral Berkeley. He requested that all of the autopsy materials be transferred to him and the Kennedy family, specifically that they be given to Mrs. Lincoln in the National Archives. Mrs. Lincoln, Evelyn Lincoln, had been JFK's personal secretary for 12 years. She had a courtesy office in the National Archives in which she was allowed to conduct Kennedy family business. So Robert F. Kennedy was asking Berkeley to transfer all the autopsy photographs, the autopsy x-rays, and other materials, which included what was left of the brain and various tissue slides and other documents, to transfer these materials to Evelyn Lincoln, to the Kennedy family custody. Admiral Berkeley did so. And in doing so, he created an inventory of what he was taking away from the Secret Service, where these items had been stored in the Executive Office Building in Washington. Paragraph 9 of the inventory included memos about autopsy photography, it included an original autopsy report, and it also included a metal container containing gross material, 6 by 8 inches in dimensions. In future years, Admiral Berkeley clarified to the HSCA that that container did contain what was left of President Kennedy's brain. He should know he's the person who had these materials under lock and key in the executive office building. He's the person who drew up the inventory, which was signed by him and 3 or 4 Secret Service personnel in April 1965, and he's the person that delivered the materials in person to Evelyn Lincoln. So the Kennedy family had these materials, all of these autopsy materials, for about a year and a half. But the Kennedy family was forced to return the materials to the federal government in 1966. Congress had passed a law saying all autopsy-related evidence must be kept by the National Archives. This included the autopsy materials, so the Justice Department conducted negotiations with the Kennedy family for the return of these materials. The Kennedy family did return most of the materials to the U.S. government on October 31st, 1966. The Kennedy family prepared its own inventory of what was returned to the government in 1966. The original inventory prepared by Dr. Berkeley in 1965 was 9 paragraphs long. The Kennedy family inventory of what was being given back to the government was only 7 paragraphs long. One of the missing paragraphs was paragraph 9. Paragraph 9 in the original inventory included the brain. Now, the archives officials were immediately aware of this discrepancy. They compared the deed of gift inventory with 7 paragraphs to the original inventory made by Dr. Berkeley with 9 paragraphs. They knew that all the paragraph 9 items were missing. They knew this on October 31st, 1966. The government decided not to tell the American people about this for several years. Noted forensic pathologist Dr. Cyril Wecht of Pennsylvania was one of the very first private citizens to examine the autopsy materials. He did so in 1971, I believe, and immediately reported the fact that the brain was missing to the New York Times, and the American people became aware of that. The absence of the brain is a serious problem for anyone who would wish to question the Warren Commission's findings or who would wish to re-examine all the medical evidence himself and try to figure out what happened to JFK and Dealey Plaza. So Cyril Wecht made us aware of this problem. It's the Kennedy family that did not return the brain and other paragraph 9 materials to the U.S. government. Burke Marshall, the Kennedy family attorney, told the HSCA in the late 1970s that Robert F. Kennedy had disposed of the paragraph 9 materials so that they would no longer be accessible to anyone. He claimed to have no personal knowledge of exactly what happened to them, but he did claim to know with certainty that RFK had made them inaccessible forever. Skull fragments and bullet fragments are missing today from the official collection of autopsy evidence. 3 skull fragments that were seen at the autopsy on President Kennedy are missing today. These are fragments of cranial bone brought into the Bethesda morgue late during JFK's autopsy by the Secret Service. One of the 3 pathologists that night, Army forensic pathologist Pierre Fink, was having great difficulty establishing points of entry and exit in the skull for the assassin's bullet. After a considerable period of confusion and complaining, the Secret Service responded to Dr. Fink's queries by bringing in these 3 pieces of skull bone into the morgue. Fortunately, the 3 pieces of cranial bone were x-rayed, and the x-ray has survived, and we have the x-ray today. It would be very useful today if investigators could hold the cranial bone fragments in their hands and examine the beveling. The largest bone fragment contained evidence of beveling or cratering which would have indicated probably a point of exit on the skull, and an examination of the fragment would indicate whether the point of exit was on the outside or the inside of the skull, for example. Another one of the fragments, the smallest of the three, completed the circumference of a wound of entry in the skull, according to Dr. Boswell, one of the Navy pathologists. It would be very useful to examine that fragment today and determine whether the exterior surface of the skull showed an entry and whether the interior surface of the skull on the fragment showed beveling. However, we can't examine any of the fragments because they're missing today. We know they were not interred with the body. They're simply missing. The bullet fragments that are missing fall into two categories. One witness, mortician Tom Robinson, observed a vial or test tube full of approximately 10 small dust-sized metal fragments at the autopsy, removed from President Kennedy's cranium. That vial of 10 fragments is not in the official collection today. It's missing. Another witness from the night of the autopsy, Navy Petty Officer Dennis David, prepared a receipt for 4 large bullet fragments and actually was allowed to handle the fragments after he typed the receipt. A federal agent had him type a receipt. He was allowed to handle the 4 fragments. His estimate was that the 4 fragments were more than the mass of 1 bullet and less than the mass of 2 complete bullets. So these were much larger fragments than Tom Robinson saw in the test tube vial. These fragments, handled by Dennis David, were significant enough and large enough that he was asked to prepare a receipt for the federal agent. That receipt is missing today, as are the 4 fragments. The draft autopsy report was burned and a signed copy is now missing. I cannot overemphasize the importance of this problem. We know that the first draft of the autopsy report and most of the handwritten notes made the night of the autopsy are missing with certainty because the chief pathologist, Dr. James J. Humes, admitted under oath to the review board in 1996 that he destroyed in his fireplace on November 24, 1963, both the first draft of the autopsy report and the handwritten notes made at the autopsy. One of the paragraph 9 materials that the Kennedy family never returned to the federal government was a signed, smooth copy of the autopsy report signed by Dr. Humes. That is also missing today because none of the paragraph 9 materials were turned over by the Kennedy family to the National Archives. So you see, we know that the first draft is missing, and we know that the first signed version is missing. This has serious implications. If there was a trial today, the autopsy report of record, Commission Exhibit 387, in the National Archives, which at best can only be the third written version of the autopsy report, would not be admitted into evidence. No judge in his right mind would admit the existing autopsy report into evidence at a trial when he knows that the first draft was burned and the first signed version is missing. Equally disturbing, if not more so, is that the Secret Service has recently destroyed protective survey reports dating from September through November of 1963. Let me explain what this means. After the JFK Records Act was passed by Congress in 1992, it instructed federal agencies to search for assassination records and to either submit them directly to the National Archives immediately, if they were willing to release them in full, or to sequester those documents, to set them aside for later review by the Assassination Records Review Board if those agencies did not want the documents released. So agencies had to search for records. They had to set them aside. If they didn't want them released, they had to give them to the archives if they were willing to release them in full. Furthermore, the National Archives briefed all federal agencies on the requirements of the JFK Records Act before the review board came into existence. So all of these agencies were instructed that you will not destroy any JFK assassination records. If you don't think they're important, if you want to destroy them, you're not allowed to do so. You would have to ask the review board's permission. Well, the review board's formation was delayed a little bit by the presidential election in 1992. The first President Bush, who had lost the presidential election to Bill Clinton in 1992, had in his possession the 5 names that had been nominated by professional societies to be the 5 board members of the ARRB. He decided to withhold those names from Bill Clinton and not share them with him. So as a result, after Bill Clinton took office, those people had to be renominated by the professional societies that named them. And then Bill Clinton and Al Gore, who had been very busy during their first 100 days with new activities, new legislation, had put the review board business on the back burner initially. So eventually, the Clinton administration found the time to forward the 5 nominations to the Senate for its advice and consent. Eventually, the Senate did confirm the 5 names nominated. The Clinton administration provided seed money that the review board used initially to begin hiring staff. So the review board officially began its activities on October 1st, 1994. And during the first year of its existence, proceeded to construct an office within an office building in downtown D.C. and to hire staff members. Hiring staff members was a very time-consuming evolution. It took a lot of time. So midway through this first year of activity, the head of research analysis for the ARRB, Jeremy Gunn, began to draw up a list of documents that the review board wanted from each major federal agency, documents that we wanted them to search for, documents the review board wanted to examine. About January of 1995, the review board staff made its requirements known to the Secret Service. And one of the categories of records they wanted to see were the protective survey reports on the protection of President Kennedy. Well, as it turned out, the survey reports for a specific period, September through November of 1963, were not forthcoming from the Secret Service record holders. For about 6 months, the Secret Service officials in charge of these records conducted stalling actions and provided various excuses for why they couldn't find these records. After 6 months of persistent inquiry by Jeremy Gunn and Dr. Joan Zimmerman, the Secret Service finally admitted that the protective survey reports from September through November of 1963 had been destroyed by them in January of 1995. They had conducted their destruction of these records after being told by the National Archives that it was illegal to do so, and they conducted their destruction of these records at the same time that the review board staff was holding internal discussions about which records to request of the Secret Service. The implications are very disturbing. Included in the records destroyed by the Secret Service were protective survey reports for President Kennedy's trips to Miami and to Chicago in November of 1963. Now we know today, because of an undercover police sting conducted by the Miami police at the time, we know today that there was an assassination plot in the works in Miami. And it didn't come down, it didn't take place in November of 1963, but that's probably why President Kennedy's motorcade was canceled and he flew by helicopter instead to a speaking site. We also know today that there was an assassination plot in the works in the city of Chicago in November of 1963. And probably the only reason that that plot was not executed is because President Kennedy's trip was canceled literally at the last minute. It was canceled that morning. The reasons for the cancellation are unclear. It might have been related to the plot. It might have been related to the crisis in Vietnam caused by the coup in Vietnam overthrowing President Diem. But at any rate, those protective survey reports for that time period could have provided valuable information to the review board and to the American people about the Miami and Chicago assassination plots. I'd like to talk now about the deception in the medical evidence, the substitution of false evidence into the official record. Many of the items destroyed or missing appear to have been replaced by highly suspect items of evidence. For example, the existing autopsy report is the third written version of that document. As I mentioned earlier, the first draft was burned, and the first signed version is missing, whereabouts unknown. The 3 extant skull x-rays are all altered copy films. They're composites or forgeries. We'll discuss this in detail later in the presentation. The autopsy photos of the back of JFK's head have been disowned, impugned, by the sworn testimony of both FBI agents at JFK's autopsy and by many other witnesses. Now, this controversial autopsy image, seemingly showing the rear of JFK's head to be intact and suggesting a small entrance wound high in the scalp near the corner of the ruler, is at odds with overwhelmingly consistent eyewitness testimony from both Parkland Hospital in Dallas and Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland. The vast majority of these witnesses have recalled an avulsed exit wound the size of a baseball in the rear of President Kennedy's head and no entry wound near the cowlick. Now, the witnesses who insist they saw a large avulsed wound in the rear of JFK's head, consistent with a wound of exit and devoid of both scalp and bone, include the Parkland Hospital emergency treatment physicians. Now, there were many more physicians than this in Trauma Room 1 at Parkland Hospital in Dallas. These are the names of the most critical witnesses who were the closest to President Kennedy during treatment. These are the people who were standing around the gurney while an attempt was made to save President Kennedy's life, so they had the best view of his wounds. Other people who insist they saw a large blowout in the back of the head were the Parkland Hospital nurses. These are the names of some of the key nurses. Secret Service agent Clint Hill, who rode to Parkland Hospital atop the limousine and observed the president's head wound close up for about 7 minutes, described the wound that he saw eloquently in both a written report and in his sworn testimony before the Warren Commission. Secret Service agent Clint Hill, who rode to Parkland Hospital atop the limousine and observed the president's head wound close up for about 7 minutes, observed the same wound seen by the emergency treatment staff at Parkland Hospital. In a written report dated November 30th, 1963, Clint Hill stated that the right rear of President Kennedy's head was missing and lying in the back seat, and that his brain was exposed. He repeated this description in his sworn testimony before Arlen Specter and the Warren Commission in the spring of 1964. Clint Hill had plenty of time to observe the head wound, and at no time did he describe any damage to the top of President Kennedy's head or to the right side. The only damage Clint Hill described, and the only damage described the day of the assassination by the Parkland Hospital treatment staff, was to the right rear of President Kennedy's head. Both FBI agents present at JFK's autopsy at Bethesda Naval Hospital recall seeing a large wound in the right rear of the head. And additional witnesses who have disagreed with the back of the head photos include the following people. Now, at one time or another, all of these people in various interviews have disagreed with the photograph that you just examined. The 3 autopsy pathologists, Navy doctors James J. Humes and J. Thornton Boswell, and Army Dr. Pierre A. Fink, have generally supported the intact appearance of the head in the photo, but they have all vehemently disagreed with the location of the apparent entrance wound in the photo. None of these 3 men, when they testified to the review board, agreed that the red spot in the cowlick near the ruler was the entrance wound in the back of the head. The entrance wound that they observed in the back of the head at autopsy was much lower in the skull and cannot be seen in the extant photographs. Now, the two FBI agents at JFK's autopsy have impugned the accuracy of this autopsy photograph under oath. I cannot overemphasize the importance of this fact. The FBI agents Seibert and O'Neill were trained observers. Their word and their veracity was routinely relied upon in courts of law and in official reports. This is what they both said to the review board staff under oath in 1997. Agent Seibert looked at the photograph you have just examined and said, quote, "I don't recall anything like this at all during the autopsy. It looks like it could have been reconstructed or something," end quote. And Frank O'Neill said, quote, "This looks like it's been doctored in some way, like the stuff has been pushed back in, and it looks like more toward the end than at the beginning. I thought there was a larger opening in the back of the head," end quote. It's also important to understand that both of these men, when we deposed them in 1997, were still J. Edgar Hoover loyalists. They still wanted to believe that Lee Harvey Oswald had killed the president. They were still loyal to the deceased director of the FBI. So these men had no motive to spin a tale or to endorse conspiracy theories, and yet they both gave us this vital testimony that impugns the accuracy of these key autopsy photographs. In 1997, under oath before the ARRB, former agent James Seibert made this wound diagram of the damage he observed to the back of JFK's head at the autopsy. These two FBI agents had both made hand-drawn sketches of the wounds they recalled for the HSCA in the 1970s. Frank O'Neill remembered making the drawing that was in the HSCA records and verified to us that it was still an accurate representation of what he remembered. Agent Seibert did not remember making the drawing that he made for the HSCA, so we asked Agent Seibert to execute this new drawing for us. We used an anatomical template from an anatomy atlas to ensure accuracy, so that on this occasion, Seibert wasn't making a freehand sketch. He was using a clear image of the back of the skull. The first defect that Agent Seibert drew with dotted line was his first recollection of the size of the wound. He then reconsidered this later during his deposition and went back and drew a larger circle around the original dotted line. The larger version is his final opinion on the size of the wound that he recalls seeing in President Kennedy's head at the autopsy at Bethesda. This diagram by Agent Seibert and the diagram executed by Frank O'Neill for the HSCA are remarkably consistent with the wounds described by the Parkland Hospital treatment staff, as we'll see in the upcoming slides. Now, the autopsy radiologist, Dr. John Ebersol, also disagreed with this autopsy photograph when testifying before the HSC medical panel in 1978. Under oath, Dr. Ebersol gave the following comments. Quote, "My recollection is more of a gaping occipital wound than this. I can certainly not state that this is the way it looked," end quote. And, quote, "more lateral, much more lateral and superior than I remembered," end quote. Now, Dr. Ebersol gave this sworn testimony to the HSCA in 1978. The HSCA staff in its report mentioned that they had deposed him, and they sequestered the record of his deposition transcript for 50 years. They didn't want us to see what he had said about this photograph or about other things concerning the autopsy. But thanks to the JFK Records Act, we now know what he said. Now, likewise, the treatment staff from Parkland Hospital in Dallas observed a head wound on President Kennedy only in the rear of the head. All of the treatment reports written by Parkland Hospital staff on the day of the assassination describe the wound as either occipital or occipital parietal or as posterior. Now, posterior means the back of your head. The occipital bone is squarely in the middle of the back of your head. An occipital parietal wound would be in the right rear of your head. None of these words they used, occipital, occipital parietal, and posterior, none of these words describe damage to the top of someone's head or to the right side. And in fact, none of them at Parkland Hospital saw damage to the top of the head or to the right side of the head. They only saw damage to the right rear. Now, in confirmation of this, several treatment physicians described seeing cerebellar tissue extruding from the president's head wound. The cerebellum is a portion of the brain located at the back of the skull. I'd like to reemphasize, none of the treatment reports written at Parkland on the day of the assassination described any damage to JFK's head on the right side, directly above or forward of the right ear, or on the top of the skull. Now, the cerebellum is located low in the skull at the rear of the brain, as you can see in this image from an anatomy atlas. The damage to JFK's right cerebellum, described by several doctors and nurses at Parkland Hospital, was consistent with the wound diagrams of posterior damage to the skull made by Bell and Crenshaw. This set of models is a good way to visualize where the cerebellum is and where the occipital bone is in the skull. The model shown at the left clearly depicts the low posterior location of the cerebellum. In the model on the left, the cerebellum is painted red. So you can see that it's not only at the back of your skull, it's low in the back of your skull. And above it is the cerebral cortex. 4 treatment physicians at Parkland noted severe damage to President Kennedy's right cerebellum, indicating that the wound they observed truly was in the right rear quadrant of the skull. Now, in the center of the frame below, the occipital bone is painted red. Most descriptions of President Kennedy's head wound at Parkland were either occipital or occipital parietal, thus confirming that he had a large wound in the right rear of his skull. In this image in the center of the photograph, the occipital bone is red and the right parietal bone is colored light gray. So an occipital parietal wound would clearly still be in the right rear of the skull. The model just to the right of Sitter is my approximation of the wound described by the Dallas doctors and nurses in their written reports the day of the assassination. The one doctor that day who ascribed a dimension, a size to the wound was Dr. Carrico. And in his Warren Commission testimony and in his written treatment notes that day, he described the wound as about 5 by 7 centimeters in size. So on this skull model, I've created a wound that was 5 by 7 centimeters in size. Later, when we deposed Dr. Boswell, one of the 2 Navy pathologists, he explained that President Kennedy's skull was larger than this skull model. So what this means to you, the viewer, is that proportionally on President Kennedy's skull, the wound would have appeared a little smaller than the one on this model. This is the exact size described by Dr. Carrico, 5 by 7 centimeters, but President Kennedy's skull was larger than this. But this gives you a very accurate idea of the approximate location of the wound seen at Parkland Hospital. In 1997, my boss, Jeremy Gunn, and I made a short trip to Texas to interview 3 medical witnesses that had been missed by the Warren Commission. Jeremy Gunn was the general counsel on the review board staff, and he was also the chief analyst. All of the analysts worked for Jeremy. Jeremy Gunn was an experienced deposition attorney, knew how to interview people. I learned a lot from him. While in Texas, we interviewed on successive days, separately, of course. We interviewed Nurse Audrey Bell, Dr. Charles Crenshaw, and Dr. Robert Grossman. These 3 witnesses had been missed by the Warren Commission. Now this diagram here shows the wound on President Kennedy's head recalled by Nurse Bell. You'll note that it's in the right rear of the skull. Both Nurse Bell and Dr. Crenshaw described a wound in the right rear of the skull that was devoid of scalp and skull. There was no scalp in this area. There was no skull bone in this area. They could see brain through the wound. And in fact, they both recalled brain extruding from the wound. In 1997, third-year Parkland resident Dr. Charles Crenshaw drew this JFK wound diagram for the review board staff. You'll notice that Dr. Crenshaw's head wound is also a wound in the right rear of the skull. It's a little bit higher than Audrey Bell's, but it's in the same quadrant of the skull, the right rear of the skull. Neither one of these two witnesses described any damage to the top of the skull or to the right side. It's important to remember that. In 1996, the review board staff located and interviewed Tom Robinson, one of the morticians from Gawler's Funeral Home in Washington, D.C. He had arrived with the president's body at 6:35 p.m. and witnessed all of the procedures performed inside Bethesda Naval Hospital that night. We asked him to draw his recollection of President Kennedy's head wound as he first saw it on an anatomical template from an anatomy atlas. This is the diagram Tom Robinson executed for us. You'll note that just like Nurse Bell and just like Dr. Crenshaw, Tom Robinson drew a large wound in the rear of President Kennedy's skull. Now, the wound he recalled appears to be centerline, not on the right side, but it's still in the rear of the skull. That's the important point to take away from this exercise. The same person, Tom Robinson, drew a sketch for the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1977. It was identical to this, except that it was a freehand sketch that just showed a hole in a skull. And you couldn't really tell whether he had drawn the right side of the skull or the top or the back. So this drawing that he executed for the review board staff in 1996 is very important historically. It's identical to what he drew for the House Select Committee, but now we know what he meant, and it's clearly a wound in the back of the skull. Now, there were confirming oral descriptions of an exit wound in the rear of JFK's head provided by two high-ranking naval officers years after the event to JFK researchers. Both of these men, like the mortician Tom Robinson, were present at JFK's autopsy. One man was Dr. George Berkeley, and the other was Captain Robert O. Canada. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Berkeley was the military physician to the president. Berkeley told Kurtz in 1983 that President Kennedy had a large wound, quote, that had all the appearances of an exit wound, end quote, in the back of his head. Captain Robert Canada was the commanding officer of the treatment hospital at Bethesda. The commanding officer of the medical school portion of the complex was Captain John Stover. Captain Canada was interviewed by Mr. Kurtz in 1968, and he said that he observed a, quote, very large 3 to 5 centimeter wound in the right rear of the president's head in the lower right occipital region, end quote. Dr. Canada said that it was, quote, clearly an exit wound, end quote, because the occipital bone was avulsed or exploded outwards. I can't emphasize enough how important this is. The word avulsed does mean exploded from within to without. The witnesses at Parkland Hospital thought they were observing an avulsed wound that exploded from within to without, which would have made it an exit wound in the rear of the skull. Dr. Canada, quoted here, clearly recalled the same wound seen at Parkland Hospital, and he also thought it was an avulsed wound. I should point out that when Mr. Kurtz published this information in 2006 in his book, he revealed that he had confronted Dr. Canada with the discrepancy between Canada's description of an exit wound in the right rear of the skull with the Warren Commission's conclusion. The Warren Commission concluded that a bullet entered the right rear of President Kennedy's skull and exited the right front of the skull on top. That was the Warren Commission conclusion. So Michael Kurtz confronted Dr. Canada with the discrepancy between his recollection of an exit wound in the right rear of the head and the Warren Commission's conclusions. And in his book, Mr. Kurtz writes that Dr. Canada immediately told him, well, that was part of the cover-up. At which point, Dr. Canada then requested that Michael Kurtz withhold this description. He requested that he withhold this information until 25 years after his own death. So unfortunately, Michael Kurtz did withhold the information for quite a long time, and we didn't learn about this observation by Canada until 2006. But at least Kurtz didn't wait until 25 years after Canada's death. And so we still want to thank Michael Kurtz for conducting the interview and for finally revealing its contents to us. It's highly significant. Human skull bone, known as the Harper fragment, was found in Dealey Plaza on Saturday, November 23, 1963. It was photographed and examined by 3 Dallas area pathologists, which we'll discuss some more on the next slide. Now, I want you to examine these 2 images. Everything was done properly in these 2 photographs. They're in good focus. The bone fragment is photographed next to a ruler. So you can see the ruler is in inches in this scale. And the image on the left is the exterior surface, the outside surface of the Harper fragment. The image on the right is the interior surface. And you know it's the interior surface because you can see the markings made by several blood vessels in the bone. These photographs were made by Dallas physicians and hospital staff. That's why they were done properly. And you can see them today in the National Archives in color by special appointment. Let's discuss the significance of these fragments. Now, the examination of the Harper fragment by 3 Dallas area pathologists the very weekend after the assassination revealed that it was occipital bone from the rear of the skull. Let's talk about this. This, first of all, corroborates the observations of all other witnesses who saw an apparent blowout in the rear of JFK's head. This fragment was delivered to Rear Admiral Berkeley, JFK's military physician, by the FBI. He signed a receipt for it, and that receipt exists today, as well as signing for one other skull fragment found in Dealey Plaza, so-called Burroughs fragment. Both of those fragments are missing today. The last person to sign for them was Rear Admiral Berkeley. For this reason, Admiral Berkeley, who was also present during the autopsy, is the prime suspect, I think, for what happened to the 3 missing skull fragments that were x-rayed. I spoke earlier about the 3 fragments x-rayed during the autopsy, the 3 fragments brought to the morgue late during the autopsy by the Secret Service. Those have also disappeared. Dr. Berkeley would appear to be the prime suspect for disposing of those as well. Now, the independent finding that the Harper fragment was occipital bone was arrived at by pathologists Jack Harper, Gerard Noteboom, and Dr. A.B. Cairns, the head of pathology at Methodist Hospital. They arrived at this conclusion, recorded in 2 different FBI interviews, by close personal examination of the fragment itself before there was any official explanation for the assassination. I can't emphasize how important this is. These men were guided by no prejudice, by no official findings, for that matter, by no eyewitness testimony of what anyone had seen. They simply received an item of physical evidence on Saturday, the day after the assassination. They examined it. They determined that it was human bone, human skull bone. They determined that it was fresh, that the blood markings on it were very fresh, and came to a unanimous conclusion that it was occipital bone. Later, in the 1970s, the House Select Committee on Assassinations interviewed Dr. Cairns, who is the chief of pathology at this hospital and was the chief of this team of 3 people that examined the bone the day after the assassination. He was the senior member present. They interviewed Dr. Cairns, and Dr. Cairns told the HSCA staff in the late 1970s that the bone was definitely occipital, and he knew that from examining the tables of the skull and the blood vessel markings on the interior side of the fragment. That staff interview, along with all HSCA staff interviews of all autopsy witnesses, were buried for 50 years. And only because of the JFK Records Act do we have those reports to read today. This report is one of them, with Dr. Cairns. So thanks to Oliver Stone's movie, JFK, we have the JFK Records Act, and thanks to the JFK Records Act, we now have the House Select Committee on Assassinations staff interview reports of multiple medical witnesses who all describe things very much at variance with the autopsy report, as we'll see. Now, this finding by those 3 pathologists on November 23, 1963, that the Harper fragment was definitely occipital bone is extremely important. It corroborates the observations of all of the Parkland Hospital treatment staff and of Secret Service agent Clint Hill that President Kennedy had a wound in the rear of his skull, a wound in the right rear of his head, not in the top of his head and not in the right side of his head. During its deliberations, the House Select Committee on Assassinations established a forensic pathology panel. The consensus, after considerable argument and disagreement by the forensic pathology panel, was that the Harper fragment was parietal bone from the top of the head. This is by the forensic pathology panel of the HSCA in the late 1970s. The problem, ladies and gentlemen, is that they did not have the bone in their hands. They could not examine the bone with their eyes. Dr. Cairns and Dr. Noteboom and Dr. Harper did have the bone in their hands and could examine it with their eyes, and I believe they made the definitive judgment on what type of bone it was and from whence it came in the president's skull. The House Select Committee Forensic Pathology Panel exhibited a severe bias, which I believe led to serious flaws in all of their findings. They bet the farm on the authenticity of the autopsy photographs and the autopsy x-rays. They made a judgment that all of the autopsy photographs were accurate and to be trusted, and that the surviving skull x-rays, the 3 surviving skull x-rays, were accurate and to be trusted. As my presentation shows, neither the autopsy photographs nor the skull x-rays are accurate or to be trusted for various reasons. We'll go into those details momentarily. This was the serious weakness in the methodology employed by the HSCA Forensic Pathology Panel, in my view. They assumed that all the autopsy photos and x-rays, especially the skull x-rays, were authentic, accurate, and to be trusted, and forced their conclusions about everything else to fit into that paradigm. My presentation reveals that there are significant problems with almost all the autopsy photographs and with all 3 skull x-rays. Therefore, I believe the HSCA Forensic Pathology Panel's conclusions are largely incorrect.